What's up, guys? Coming at you. It's 7:30 in the morning. I'm pretty tired today. Had an awesome weekend. So today I wanted to show you guys some cool things I learned about components and hooks and memoization. Mainly how you can return components from your hooks. Usually that's a big no-no. Really creating components at all in your render function is a big no-no, but I'm going to show you today why you might want to do it sometimes and how you can do it, but usually it's still a big no-no. But I feel like exploring limitations and abstractions is a good idea. Before I show you that, I wanted to just give you a quick look at what I'm working on recently. I'm doing the next big version of React Table, which is pretty cool. It's a headless version of React Table. It's really powerful. It's React Table is used by a lot of great companies. A lot of the professional sports associations in our lovely nation use React Table. Lots of big companies like it. Got some great sponsors here. Shout out to them, Retool and Zappy and Nozzle. You guys can also become sponsors. You don't have to become a silver sponsor if you don't want, but I do have a Patreon. You guys can support me building open source software. I mostly do it all by myself, so it can get kind of crazy sometimes, but it's a lot of fun. So, on to the good stuff. How do we return components from our hooks, and why would we want to do that? So there's two reasons that I can think of that are that we can explore for returning something from our returning components from our hooks. So one of those is, let's say we have like a theme component, right? Or like a theme provider or whatever. And then we have some stuff inside it that uses the theme, right? Well, usually context is created by a component to hand stuff down. But say we wanted access to that context right here, this would have to be the place that we create it. Or another example would be like a form component that also creates context and passes, inputs that use the form down. Things like this, where if we wanted to use these as hooks, we would end up doing something really funny. The thing that we end up doing is this. In fact, I like the form example. Let's go with that. Most form libraries give you a form component, and then if you want access to the form state, you have to use like a child render function, and you would get like values or something like that, and then you could return, whatever you want inside of here. Then you could use values, and that's great, but then you don't get to use values in the component where you create the form. And then some people are like, well, that's why you need to use a higher order component around the whole outside component so you gain access to that. Well, higher order components are dumb, especially now that we have hooks. So somebody might say, well, let's turn this into a hook, right? So we'll have some hook that's some custom hook that we build that's like use form. Well, that's awesome. But then we're also going to have like some form component, that consumes that hook, whatever that hook returns, right? It's going to create some context, but hooks cannot pass context down. Hope you guys have heard of that before. So just because you create a hook here does not mean you can actually pass context down through your tree using that. You have to render the context somewhere. Forms are like a weird chicken and egg problem. So here, if we wanted to do this, we'd have to say like form instance you know, and we'd have to pass the form thing down that it returned from this. And then luckily, you know, like we could use that to supply the context down to anything like this that's anything that's using it. I don't like that because I have a separate component here for rendering the context and doing whatever things, you know, accepting props. And then I have like a hook here so that I can gain access to the values. What if I wanted to merge these two things, you know, like have those kind of be in one thing? Well, I'm going to show you a little trick that would help you do this. And I'm actually doing this for forms in my nozzle code. I have not released that form code yet. I'm still working on it, but it's pretty neat. Let me show you how I do that. Let's create a useForm hook here. And reuseForm is going to return a bunch of stuff. Let's say it's going to return values, right? And that's why we wanted it in the first place, so like we could have access to the values up here. But then we need to have some type of a form component, and I don't want to have to bind, you know, like hook up all this binding stuff where this would return, you know, an instance or a context or whatever, and then we'd have to bind that into this form. That sounds like it does not sound fun. So what if we could just return a form component from our hook right here? Well, let's see what happens when we do that. So if we were just to return a new form, we have to make that form component in here. So we'd say like const form, you know, hey, this form is going to just render children in a form element, right? Sweet. Let's just make values really quick here so it doesn't freak out. Or we'll just get rid of values for now. So let's say we do this and we return a form component from useForm. We already have a problem because every single time, in fact, let's do this. Let's say form and the form. And let's just put like a div right here, and then we'll put an input, something like that. Okay, so we already have a problem. I don't know if you've already spotted this problem, but this form component that we are creating in our hook is being created every single time we render this component. This form component is a new thing every single time. What that means is that React is going to think that it's a different component every single time we render this application. That sucks because it's going to unmount this component and remount and mount the new form component that we just created here. This happens all the time when people try and create, you know, components inside of their render function. They try and do it right here, you know. It's like, oh, my div, and it takes these props and it returns a div with the stuff inside it. Then they try and use that down here, and they don't realize that they're rendering a new component every single time that this thing renders. So you shouldn't make components in your render function. So how are we supposed to do this? Well, there's an awesome utility from React called React Memo. useMemo. We're going to use the hook version. And what that does is, why am I getting? Oh, right. So what useMemo does is it will only run this function and return the result when the things inside of this dependency array change. And if you give it a blank dependency array, then it will only run this function when the component mounts. That's pretty cool, because if we run this code now and we were to re-render this, let's see, let's make some state here so we can re-render. Const state set state equals react use state. We'll start with 0. And let's put a little button here that has the state, and when we click it, we're going to set state old plus 1. Okay, and let's render out console log form. Let's console log this out. I'm going to open up my console here. Let's see if we can make this. Okay, so you'll see that we're logging out this. Let me make my console a little bit bigger here. We're logging out the reference to this component now. And actually, if we were to do this, if we were to say, you know, window Tanner equals form, right? And then we can say console log, does the form equal window Tanner? Does the form equal the last version? We'll say that. The first one's going to say false because window Tanner doesn't equal anything. Oh, form equals window Tanner. Oh, I gotta get the right caps here. The first one's going to say false, but after that it's just going to say true, because every time we're incrementing, like, we're not recreating that form element. This is really cool. This lets us start to do some interesting things. So you got to think of it that this form component is something new every time this hook or this app component mounts. This form component is going to be its own thing. So now that we have that form component, we can do some cool things. Let's set up some state inside of here. Let's do values. Set values equals react use state. We'll do a little thing there. We'll say values, set values, set values. So now we're getting values back too. And then what if our form needed access to those values? That is a good question. Let's see. Let's say our form, just for the heck of it, we're going to say our form logs we'll say JSON stringify values null to. Okay. Now, let's say our form would need all of the values. It would need all the state, things like this that we want to provide to the form. It's going to need. But now we have a problem again, because so let's do this. Let's see. We have values. Let's do set values. And instead of doing that here, we're going to say set values to. Let's do this. Old, and we'll say count, or no, we'll say random equals math random. State is not defined, that's okay. Oops, I guess we need something to click on. We'll say, let's see, randomize form. Okay, so when we're clicking this button, nothing is happening, and that's because under the hood, the values are actually updating. In fact, let's put those values, let's do the same thing up here, stringify values null to. So the first values is being referenced from the hook, and it's getting updated because every time we're getting it back from the hook, you can reference it. So it's being updated right here. But why isn't this form one being updated? Well, it's because this form component is frozen in time from when we mounted it, right? this form component is saying stringify the values at the time when I was created, basically. These values are being closed over in this closure, and they will forever be stringified in there. So how can we get the form to actually render out these things? Well, one way would be to let's just call this API, and we're going to set up all of these things that we want to return from our hook in this API variable. And we're going to move this form value below the API variable. And then we're going to try and pass this API to the form component. So the first time that this React memo runs, it's going to create the new form component. The second time, it's just going to return the same one. So what if we could just attach this new API to the form component? So we could say form API equals API. And now inside of here, instead of, let's see, this new component, let's make this a little more readable. Oh, whoops, not that. Return. There we go. So we'll do this. We'll say const values equals form API. So when this form component renders, we're going to grab all of these values right here off of the API that we're assigning to the form every time. So instead of creating the form component every time, we're just mutating a static value on the form component every single time that we're going to render it, every single time that this updates. And there we can therefore provide values to the component even though the component isn't changing. We can provide contextual values to it, almost like binding. So now you can see that these are updating. And in our form component can use anything from inside of this API just like normal. And in fact, I like to kind of move this out into a separate function called makeForm. Return form. And then I like to call this right here. So const form equals makeForm. MakeForm, let's see. useMemo is called in function, which is neither a function component or... Okay, so we'll say this. useForm component. There. So what this is allowing us to do is now we'll pass the API in right here. That way we don't have to worry about that. So it'll get the API. So we're creating the form component one time, right, when we mount the application. And the component should never change. Component source should really never change when you're using your app, just the props and the data that run through them. So we're running the API data through the form component every single time. Now, you might be asking, like, why don't we use context to do this? Well, we haven't rendered any context yet. So we wouldn't be able to pass that context to this form component. In fact, this form component is probably what's going to be rendering the context anyway. So in a way, what we'd want to do is we would want to create a context right here. We could say const, you know what, we could just do it in here. We could say const form context. We'd probably want to do it outside. So we can say const form context equals React create context. And then what we'll do is we will pass that context down in our API. And then right here, we will get that context from the API here. We can say form context provider. And we can pass down the entire form API again. Woo! Let's see. That comes up here. Okay. So now anything that we render inside of this form also would have access to the form context. So let's see if we can make that happen. Let's render a special input. And here we got to make that input first. Let's do function input. And then right here we'll say form API equals React use context. We'll use the form context right here. And then this input, let's actually have that render the JSON values right here. So this will just be children now. And we'll have this return a div for now with the values inside it. And the values are going to come from this. Boom. So let's get rid of this outer one and kind of go through what we have created. So let's actually wire this up. Let's make an input. So instead of randomizing a bunch of stuff, let's do this. Input field equal, or we'll just do name equals foo. Okay, and then this input is going to take the name, and this is going to be set values that we get from here. This is very rudimentary, but you could see how you can almost build your own form component doing this. So instead of stringifying all that stuff here, this is going to just be an input. We're going to say value equals values name, and then we'll say on change. We will take the event, and we will set values, take the old one, return all the old stuff, but we're going to make name the target value. We got a log console error here. Synthetic event reused. Oh, I see. We need to persist and then set the value. Cool. So this input is just working. We have access to the context here, the form context. But the great thing is that we also have access to those values up here. So we can make, we could say, you know, if values foo equals Tanner, then we're going to render hi Tanner. Otherwise, we're not going to render anything. We could do that outside of our form here. See? And that's great. We have one single interface to work with a form. Now, this is a very new concept that I am still fleshing out. Returning components from hooks. It could be a foot gun, possibly, but as you can see, it can also be very handy. Where the form is providing the context to anything underneath it, but we also have access to that context from the hook itself. This is really cool. You could do this with anything from themes. Really, I think it shines the best when you want to send things down through context somehow with using a component or a provider, but you want access to those things as well when you create it. So I hope you guys liked this tip. Again, be sure to subscribe on YouTube. I'm going to try and make these videos a little shorter like this one. Quick little tips. Subscribe on YouTube, follow me on Twitter. Go check out my projects. React Static is a really popular one that I'm pretty proud of. We can build progressive static sites in React. It feels a lot like Create React App. Also, go check out React Table. And I've even got some other fun ones like useSelect that I'm working on. It's a hook for building select boxes, basically. It's a headless hook. So I got lots of stuff. Go check it out, subscribe, tweet at me, ask me questions, and hopefully I will see you again in the next day or two for another video. So thanks guys. We'll see ya.